I never wanted to come back to my uncle's house. Not after what happened when I was 12. Back then, it wasn't even a house yet, just an abandoned train station he'd bought, thinking he could turn it into some kind of rustic getaway. It was miles from the nearest town, buried in the woods, with no roads leading up to it. The only way to get there was on foot or by the old rail tracks that hadn't been used in decades. He invited me to spend the weekend with him, saying it would be an adventure. I was young, restless, and always looking for excitement, so I said yes. The plan was simple. 2 nights out there, just the two of us. He promised we'd fish in the river, build a bonfire, and maybe even find some cool old relics from when the station was still running. It sounded fun at the time. The first day went by without a hitch. We explored the crumbling platforms, found an old ticket booth half buried in ivy, and even discovered a rusted-out train car that had been left to rot on a broken track behind the station. That night we ate by the fire, listening to the night sounds of the forest. It was quiet, too quiet maybe, but I didn't think much of it. The next morning I woke up early. My uncle was still asleep, snoring under his thick wool blanket. I decided to step outside and get some fresh air. That's when I saw them. Footprints, a single set of them, leading from the trees straight to the station. I stood there staring at them in the dirt. They weren't my uncle's. His boots were too big, and they definitely weren't mine. I felt a weird tightness in my stomach. Someone had been here. But why? I followed the footprints for a while, my heart thudding louder with every step. They trailed away from the station, winding toward the old train car we'd found the day before. But what sent a chill down my spine was this. There were no footprints leading back. Whoever had come here hadn't left. I turned back toward the station, suddenly uneasy. Maybe it was just some lost hiker. Maybe I was overreacting. I told myself that, but my feet moved faster than my thoughts. I pushed through the station doors and shook my uncle awake. "There's someone out there," I whispered. He grunted, half asleep. "What?" "Footprints," I said, my voice urgent. "They came from the woods. They go to the train car, but they don't come back." That got his attention. He sat up, rubbing his face, then stood and grabbed his flashlight. "Stay here," he told me. I didn't listen. I followed him as he stepped outside, scanning the trees. The footprints were still there, clear as day. Together we traced them back toward the rusted train car. My uncle hesitated at the door, then pulled it open. Nothing. The car was empty. Just a dark, dusty space filled with broken seats and bits of shattered glass. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "See?" I mumbled. "Probably just old tracks. Maybe I..." Then we heard it, a crunch of gravel behind us. We turned at the same time, but there was nothing there. Just the open space of the station yard, the footprints, and the heavy stillness of the morning. Someone was watching us. I knew it. My uncle knew it. "We're leaving," he said. We packed up within minutes. Neither of us spoke as we made our way down the overgrown tracks, heading back towards civilization. The whole way, I felt like someone was following us. I never saw them, but I felt them. I never told anyone what happened that weekend. My uncle never spoke of it either. He sold the station the next year, and I never went back, until now. I don't know why I came back. Maybe to prove to myself that it was nothing, that it was all in my head. But as I stand here now, staring at the rusted train car, my breath catches in my throat. There in the dirt, fresh footprints, leading from the trees, and still, no footprints leading back. I left work late that night, later than usual. The restaurant had already gone dark except for a dim light in the kitchen. Outside, the streets were nearly empty, A few cars passed in the distance, their headlights flickering against wet pavement. But otherwise, the city felt quiet. Too quiet. By the time I reached my apartment building, a familiar uneasiness crept up my spine. It wasn't like anything was obviously wrong, just that odd feeling, like when you sense someone watching you but turn around to find no one there. I shook it off. Inside, my apartment was just as I had left it. Small, a little cluttered, but home. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I locked the door behind me, kicked off my shoes, and tossed my bag onto the couch. My usual routine. I grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen and sat down, flipping through the channels on the TV without really watching. I was exhausted but not sleepy, that wired, jittery kind of tired that makes it hard to relax. That's when I heard the first noise, a soft sound, muffled, coming from the other side of the apartment. I paused, turning down the volume. The pipes, the old building settling? Maybe, but something about the way the sound came and went, it didn't feel random. I stood up, moving slowly toward the hallway. The sound had come from the closet. Now my closet was nothing special, just a narrow space where I kept coats, extra blankets, and boxes of stuff I never used. There was no reason for anything in there to make a sound. My hand hovered over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but my pulse had already picked up. I turned the knob and pulled the door open. At first, everything looked normal. Jackets hanging in a neat row, storage bins stacked in the corner. But then I noticed something strange. The air smelled off, like old damp metal. And near the bottom of the closet, at the very back, a wooden panel was slightly open. I crouched down, frowning. That panel had always been sealed. I'd never touched it, never even thought twice about it. But now a gap ran along the edge, just wide enough for someone to have pulled it loose. A chill spread across my skin. I reached forward, fingers barely brushing against the rough wood. And then, footsteps, not outside, not from a neighbor's apartment, inside. Someone was moving in my apartment. The sound came from the bathroom, slow, steady steps, not hesitant, not confused. Someone was in there. I went completely still, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. My body wanted to freeze, to lock up, but I forced myself to move. I turned, walking as quietly as I could toward the front door. My keys were on the counter. If I could just grab them. A sudden, heavy sprint. The footsteps exploded into motion, racing down the hallway toward me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I lunged for the front door, yanked it open, and threw myself into the hallway just as the footsteps reached the doorway behind me. I didn't stop. I ran down the hall, through the stairwell, and out into the street. The rain hit my face as I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped it. When I finally managed to call 911, I could barely get the words out. The police arrived within minutes. They searched my apartment from top to bottom. No one was there, but they found the crawl space. The loose panel in my closet led to a hidden passage, a narrow tunnel that ran through the walls of the building. There were footprints in the dust, a small pile of discarded food wrappers, a blanket. Someone had been living back there, and based on the signs, they hadn't just arrived that night. They had been there for a while. Maybe they were waiting for me to fall asleep. Maybe they had been watching me for days. I moved out the next morning. Even now in a different city, a different apartment, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching, that they were waiting for me to fall asleep, and that if I had stayed just a little longer that night, I might not have made it out at all. It was a quiet night in mid-March. Nothing out of the ordinary. At the time, I worked at a gas station, usually covering afternoon shifts. But every so often, I'd take on an overnight shift when needed. That morning, I got a call asking if I could work from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., all of which would count as overtime. Without hesitation, I agreed. When I arrived, I took over for the manager and settled behind the front counter. Outside, the rain was coming down hard, and a severe storm was expected later that night. The weather seemed to keep most people indoors, as the gas station remained eerily empty. After about an hour needing something to do, I threw on my raincoat and went outside to secure anything that could get blown away in the storm. There were loose items scattered around the pumps, so I hurried to bring them inside. As I was gathering the last few things, I noticed a man standing not far from the gas station. He was on the side of the road, pacing back and forth, completely drenched. It struck me as odd, but I figured he was just waiting for a ride. I finished up and went back inside. 2 hours later, the storm hit with full force. Thunder rumbled in the distance before powerful winds and relentless rain came crashing in. I had expected bad weather, but this was far worse. The wind slammed against the building so hard that the entire room shook. At one point, the front doors flew open so violently that I thought they might snap off their hinges. Rushing over, I secured the bolt lock to keep them in place, then moved to the back storage room, away from the windows, and waited. About 30 minutes after the storm had begun, through the chaos outside, I heard a muffled sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, but as it continued, I realized it was someone banging on the front doors. Leaving the storage room, I looked across the sales floor. A figure stood outside, pounding on the glass, staring in at me. I hurried over and unlocked the door, assuming he needed help. As soon as I did, he rushed inside without saying a word. He was completely soaked, water dripping from his jacket and pooling onto the floor. But he didn't thank me. He didn't explain himself. He just started pacing, walking back and forth across the store with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. It was the same man I had seen earlier. Had he been out there this whole time? It had been over 2 hours since I first saw him. I asked if he was okay, if he needed help, but he ignored me. He just kept pacing. The longer I watched him, the more uncomfortable I became. Something was off. Deciding to call the police, I slowly backed toward the front desk and picked up the phone. But the second I did, his eyes snapped to me. He stopped pacing. That's when I noticed his hands. His knuckles were bloody and bruised. I stared too long, and when I looked back up, I could tell he was angry. "Don't," he said, his voice sharp and unwavering. I wasn't about to test him. I slowly lowered the phone. For a few agonizing seconds, he just stood there, staring at me, as if he was deciding what to do next. Then, without a word, he turned and resumed pacing. Outside, the storm raged on, shaking the building, adding to the unease of the situation. My mind raced through my options. I could try to run, but unlocking the door and escaping into the storm was risky. I could attempt to call the police again, but I didn't know how he'd react. In the end, I chose the riskiest option of all. I did nothing. I stood there watching him, waiting. For at least 20 minutes, he continued pacing, never speaking. At any moment, he could have snapped, could have done something terrible, but he didn't. Then finally, he stopped. He looked at me one last time, walked over to the door, slid the bolt lock open, and stepped out into the storm. The moment he was gone, I grabbed the phone and called the police. Whether it was because of the storm or because they didn't think it was urgent, It took them over 30 minutes to arrive. By then, the man was long gone. They never found him. The next day, after the storm had passed, a missing person report was filed. A woman had never returned home from work the night before. She had left her office at 11 p.m. and disappeared. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I was connecting things that weren't related. But that man, he had blood and bruises on his hands, like he had attacked someone. And the timeline lined up. I don't know what really happened that night, but I haven't stopped thinking about it since.